I want to welcome you all to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia tonight to our spring speaker series, even though it feels like summer, but the roses are starting to bloom out in my front yard. I've got about 15 rose bushes from David Austin, and they are all about ready to burst, and I can't wait. They smell so good, look beautiful. So we're so glad you are all here tonight. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. You also have Tess Galen, our events coordinator, who makes this all possible. We're so glad you're here tonight too, and our distinguished guest. I will introduce you in just one moment, but I'll remind you that if you are on a laptop or a computer, you should see up in the upper right-hand corner a little icon that says either speaker view or gallery view. You want speaker view, that will enable you just to see Charlie Duff during his talk and not test our eyes. You'll get the best use of the screen. In the bottom, there's both a Q&A and a chat. The chat is great if you have questions to ask of us about the technicalities, or if you want to send out your kudos to our speaker. Prefer you to put your questions in the Q&A. However, if you are on a phone or a tablet, it may be easier to use the chat. So I will be keeping track of questions in both the Q&A and the chat during the talk, and moderate the questions when Charles Duff is done with his talk. So looking forward to the Q&A. It's usually a lively time here at the Athenaeum. And as you know, if you are a part of the Athenaeum or part of our larger community, we are a group of people who love to learn, to discover, and to share in discourse with one another as we grow in awareness and understanding of the world around us, of history and literature and the built environment. So we are so pleased to have you all. If you are a newcomer and you enjoy what you experienced tonight, we invite you to learn a little bit more. Go to our website, come and visit us in person. We are open, not right this very moment, but from usually most days from 9 to 4, Monday through Friday, and love to talk with you and welcome you as a member in our community. Tonight, it is a real delight. Charlie Duff was lined up to speak a little over a year ago at the Athenaeum, and then this little thing called COVID-19 happened. And we have been trying to reschedule ever since and find a way for his schedule and ours to link up. Our hope had been that he would be able to come and be in person, but we're so grateful to you for coming online and virtually giving us a talk. In the meantime, I know you've spoken at a number of other institutions in Philadelphia, so some of the folks who are here tonight may be getting a second or third chance to hear from you, and some, we're so glad if this is your first time to hear. And Charles's book, The North Atlantic Cities, we have at least one copy in our library, and also Tess will be showing you how to purchase the book afterwards. If you don't know Charlie Duff, he's a planner, teacher, developer, and historian based in Baltimore. He has, for more than 35 years, built or rebuilt more than 300 buildings and led the revival of many of Baltimore's neighborhoods. He is besides a planner, teacher, developer, and historian, he also is an activist, I really think, helping encourage individuals and cities to think about the shape of their cities in Baltimore and elsewhere, and to follow the best practices that he has uncovered in his own research and work. He was president of Jubilee Baltimore, the city's premier community development nonprofit since 1987, and has been president of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. He is good friends with many, many of our favorite people here at the Athenaeum, and I'm sure he will become one of your favorite people tonight. So I invite you now to welcome with me virtually Charles Duff to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. We're so glad to have you here.
Well, Beth, Tess, I'm so glad to be here. I just wish I were there. I like being here in second floor front room in my own house, but I'd much rather be in the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. And it's great to be in what I think is the third oldest Athenaeum in the world. The oldest Athenaeum in the world, I stupidly thought it must be the Athenaeum Club in London, shows what I know. The oldest Athenaeum in the world is in Liverpool. And it turns out that my publisher, who's based in Liverpool, is a member of one of the only two Athenaeums in the world older than yours. So there's an international fellowship of Athenaea. I guess Athenaea is the plural of Athenaeum. And I'm glad to be at least tangentially a part of it. As Beth points out, this is, among other things, a book talk. So if we were all in the same room, then at the end of the talk, I would be sitting at a table in the back of the room and I would be smiling and I would be signing books and people would be buying books. And none of this is happening on Zoom. Um, Nonetheless, it is a book talk, and my publisher and even I certainly hope that you will pretend that I'm sitting at a table at the back of the room at the end of the talk and saying, for Aunt Marge, thanks so much, Charlie Duff, or whatever one says. So, so good. I've written a book called The North Atlantic Cities. It's possible that you've never heard the phrase, the North Atlantic Cities. I had neither. And perhaps the most serious reason I wrote this book at all, and it took 8 years to write, it's a fair amount of work, is to introduce a four-word phrase into the English language. And that four-word phrase is, you guessed it, the North Atlantic cities. I did not invent the North Atlantic cities. They've been around for a long time, but I think I did discover them. I think I may have been the first person who noticed that they were a family of cities. Probably not the first person who noticed, but maybe just the first person who thought it was important. And if so, well, good for me, because I still think it's important. And you're probably wondering what the heck I'm talking about. The only way I can get you out of this quandary is to let the pictures roll. You're looking at the cover of the book. That's a painting that was done by Johannes Vermeer in Delft in the Netherlands in about 1670. One friend of mine, actually not a friend, came into my office once, saw the book sitting on my table and said, wow, Charlie, how'd you get your iPhone to take a picture like that? Well, you know, sorry, Steve Jobs, you and Vermeer can duke it out in heaven, but this is Vermeer and he's better than any iPhone, even mine. And it should be a bit of a hint that the story includes cities and buildings in the Netherlands in the 1600s. But the back cover of the book is not little buildings on the other side of the Atlantic. It's big buildings on this side of the Atlantic. It's Park Avenue in New York. And that should show that the book actually moves across an ocean, moves through time, and doesn't just look at one kind of building. Although if you take the right attitude and if you have no sense of proportion, you could conceivably look at Park Avenue in New York and say, well, looks like a row of row houses to me, but you would need not to have any sense of proportion. Here are the North Atlantic cities. This is also from the back cover of the book. You will notice that Philadelphia is a proud member of this family. They're listed in alphabetical order. You're second from the left on the bottom row. And you can get a grasp of where these things are. And I don't know about you, but one of the things that has made this book a pleasure for me is that these are great cities. I like to walk around other people's cities. I've walked thousands of miles in these cities, and I've enjoyed almost every step of the way. I can think of some council housing in Manchester I didn't enjoy very much, but in general, I have enjoyed almost every step of thousands of miles. These are great cities, and it's been a pleasure to research them, to get to know people in them, to walk around them, and finally, to try to figure them out, to figure out what's happened to them. Why are they called North Atlantic cities? Well, because I decided to call them that. But why did I decide to call them that? Mainly because you find them on the two coasts of the North Atlantic Ocean. You find them in the British Isles and the Netherlands, which from my point of view are right about here, but you'll have to look at the map. And you find them again on our side of the ocean along the coast of the Middle Atlantic states. And they're quite a coastal phenomenon. But you find them just in these coastal countries. You find them in inland parts of coastal countries. You find them in Manchester and Birmingham in England, and those are inland cities, but they are coastal countries. How do you know if your city is North Atlantic? Well, you can look at a map, but if you don't think that's enough, ask yourself this question. Do the old neighborhoods of my city have row houses? So I asked Mr. Google whether Philadelphia had row houses, and I'm going to show you the first 3 pictures that come up when I Googled Philadelphia row houses. Here's number 1. I apologize for the graininess of it. You can take it up with Mr. Google. This is the first picture that comes up when you Google Philadelphia row houses, and quite extraordinary row houses they are too. Here's the second picture that comes up. Those are much more calm, much more sedate, much less extraordinary, also a good deal less grainy, God bless them. And here's the third, Elfreth's Alley, also grainy, but by the time you look at the top three pictures of what Mr. Google says about Philadelphia row houses, then even if you've never been to Philadelphia, and if you haven't, I advise you to go, even if you've never been to Philadelphia, you will realize that Philadelphia meets the basic test of being a North Atlantic city. Its old neighborhoods have row houses, and not just one kind of row house, and not just one century of old neighborhoods. The first slide looked to me kind of like the 1880s. Elfreth's Alley is the beginning of the 18th century. Philadelphia has an awful lot of row houses. It has different kinds of them. They come from different centuries, all of that, but you are probably from Philadelphia and you don't need me to tell you that. So Philadelphia meets the two basic tests for being a North Atlantic city. One is it's on the North Atlantic. Two is its old neighborhoods have row houses. Phew, got that out of the way. These are a rather strangely coastal phenomenon, the North Atlantic cities. If you go inland from the family of North Atlantic cities, on both sides of the ocean, you stop seeing row houses in the old neighborhoods. You get, in fact, very different ways of building cities. Again, you're thinking, what on earth is this man talking about? Okay, look at the map, look at the European side, and imagine that you're going that way from the British Isles and the Netherlands. You're going into continental Europe. Well, if you're going to continental Europe, shouldn't you stop at Paris? I think you should. It's very difficult to say anything about Paris that has never been said before. As Humphrey Bogart said, we'll always have Paris, and when people have Paris, they incessantly talk about it. Difficult to be original in talking about Paris. All the same, I'm going to give it a go, and I'm going to say something that I, at least, have never heard anybody else say about Paris. You ready? Paris does not have row houses. I hate to break it to you, but Paris does not have row houses. You look down the incomparably beautiful streets of Paris, and they are incomparably beautiful, and you see houses or buildings that are as old as the row houses of Philadelphia, but they're not row houses. They're apartment buildings. Paris is a city of apartment buildings. And not only do Parisians live in apartments, but Parisians live in apartments that are small, cramped, and often very dark, behind these beautiful facades. Paris has almost as many people per square mile as Manhattan Island, but Paris doesn't have skyscrapers. The tallest buildings in Paris look like this. As a result, the average apartment in Paris is about half the size of the average apartment in New York, on Manhattan Island. So you wonder, gee, how would I live if I lived in a little cramped apartment, dark most of the day, can't entertain at home very well, get tired of looking at the same old four walls, and I have the most beautiful streets in the world, and there are 52,000 of me per square mile, so there are an awful lot of people to support restaurants and bakeries and boulangeries and patisseries and things like that. So what kind of public life, what kind of street life do you have in Paris or in the cities of continental Europe? So again, I asked Mr. Google. I typed in Paris street life, and here's the first picture that came up. If you have ever been to Paris, and I certainly hope you have, you will look at this and you'll say, yep, looks like Paris to me. If you put 50,000 people on a square mile of land, give them beautiful streets and tiny cramped apartments, they're going to, and decent weather, Paris has good weather, they're going to invent the sidewalk cafe. They're going to invent the restaurant. Restaurant is a French word and was invented in Paris. They're going to invent brilliant street life, and they have it. It turns out that Paris, although in my humble opinion, it's the best of the cities of continental Europe, is a typical city of continental Europe. The cities of continental Europe are cities of apartments, high densities, cramped living quarters, and good street life. It's a very, very different way of building cities from what you may be used to in the North Atlantic tradition, but it's not the only other way. It's one way to build cities that's different, but what happens if you go inland from Philadelphia on the North American side? Suppose you cross the Allegheny Mountains. You find yourself in continental North America, and there you find a city of yet another type. Here is a typical city of continental North America. This happens to be Houston, Texas. But I've shown this picture to several live audiences and said, which city is this? And people gave me answers from Indianapolis to Minneapolis to almost every other Apollos you can think of. Somebody said Chicago. I was looking for the lake, but you can't win them all. This happens to be Houston, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is that live audiences of people who belong to architectural groups could not tell which city this was in continental North America. It is a good example of the normal way of building cities in continental North America. So let's look at it. And what we see is an extremely dense skyscraper core in the middle. Those tallest buildings in downtown Houston are 80 stories tall. And when you're in downtown Houston, it is at least as dense as Center City, Philadelphia, around City Hall, I think somewhat denser. But look what happens as soon as you get out of that skyscraper core. Boom, it's all gone. It looks like Arlington National Cemetery. So, I advise you when you go to Houston to rent a car. And when I had a rental car and was tooling around Houston, my friends down there said, well, you're interested in old buildings and historic districts. You ought to go look at our great historic district called Houston Heights. So I took my rental car and drove out to Houston Heights. And here is a typical way that people live in Houston Heights, typical Houston Heights house, the great historic district of Houston, Texas. Suppose you live in a house like this. Well, you can entertain at home, can't you? You have a living room, you have a dining room, you have an eat-in kitchen, you can grill out back. You can sit on the porch when it's 180 degrees, which it sometimes is in Houston. So you can entertain at home. It's really different from Paris, really different from Paris. But if you can do all this entertaining at home, and if your lot is 70 feet wide, if there are only 5 families to an acre, then what kind of street life can you support? There aren't many people within walking distance of any one place. Can you have street life like Paris? Well, again, I did what all modern people do. I asked Mr. Google, I typed in Houston street life. And here's what Mr. Google showed me. This is Houston street life. Well, you can say what you want about Houston, but here's what I'm going to say about Houston. It's really different from Paris. It's really different. There are at least 2 ways, it turns out, to build a city in what we call the free world or the Western world. There's the Paris way, which is the way of continental Europe. And there's the Houston way, which is the way of continental North America, except for Beth's hometown of San Francisco, but we'll let that pass. And these are very, very different ways. And in between them, it's our way. In between, in every sense. Sandwiched in between these 2 giant continents of city building are the thin coastal strips in which neighborhoods have row houses, the North Atlantic cities. Here is a fine example of a North Atlantic neighborhood that is firing on all cylinders. This is the first good row house neighborhood I ever got to know when I was a little kid. This is Georgetown in Washington. If you live in one of these houses in Georgetown, you can have the pleasures of people who live in Houston Heights. You have a house that's fit to live in, like me, and here in Baltimore, you can have books in the bookshelves and windows pumping in light. These houses are fit to entertain in. You can have friends over, you can have a garden out back, just like Houston. You don't even have to mow a lawn. But what kind of public life can you have? Georgetown's a lot denser than Houston. Houston has 5 families to an acre. Georgetown has about 20. But it's a lot less dense than Paris. Paris has about 200 families to an acre. So if you're in Georgetown or Center City, Philadelphia, or any good row house environment, what kind of street life do you have? Well, again, ask Mr. Google, Georgetown street life, and here's the first picture that comes up. And that's right. This is Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown. It is a 4-minute walk from the picture of the houses that you just saw. When a row house neighborhood, a North Atlantic neighborhood, is firing on all cylinders, I think we can have the best of both worlds. We can have houses that are fit to live in, but within a 4-minute, 5-minute walk, we can have a good commercial street, good public life, good street life. Best of both worlds. So I claim to have discovered the North Atlantic cities, but I'm quite unembarrassed about being an advocate for the North Atlantic way of building. It's a good way to build cities. You can have the best of both worlds. And people seem to realize that. Row houses in the North Atlantic tradition had a fairly bad 20th century, but they're bouncing back. Here is a brand new neighborhood in the suburbs of Rotterdam in Holland. Here is a brand new neighborhood in the suburbs of Baltimore in Maryland. The row house is staging a comeback. And this is good not just for architectural reasons, but also because we need to figure out how to live gracefully at higher density and how to live gracefully with a lower carbon footprint. Row houses have a much lower carbon footprint than ordinary American suburban sprawl. You can walk more, bike more, support mass transit. Very good way to do it. But row houses are houses, and we Americans are used to houses. It doesn't take too much psychic trauma to get Americans to live like this. In fact, Americans are paying $700,000-$800,000 to live in the houses that you're looking at now. The North Atlantic way of building is something that's rooted in history, but it's alive and well today. And it is, I think, not just a good way to live, but perhaps even a model for how to live as we face what may be the biggest problem that the world has that we can actually do something about. Well, little history. There was a time when what we think of as the ordinary row house did not exist. Medieval cities had proto-row houses like these, but they didn't have what Philadelphians would consider to be row houses. So let's look for a moment at these proto-row houses, which were drawn in London in about 1600. Again, I apologize for the quality of the image. My draftsmanship wasn't much in 1600. These are proto-row houses, you can tell, because they're skinny and they're fairly tall. These are the houses of common people. Noblemen lived in very different sort of urban palaces, but the common people of London and of all cities in Northern Europe, north of the Alps, lived in houses like this. They were skinny. If you were rich, they were tall. These are the houses of rich people in London in 1600. They're made of thin strips of wood with plaster in between. When you go out to the suburbs of the main line, you'll see nice houses built at the end of the 19th century that have decorative half timbering, and you'll say how lovely it is. Well, it is lovely if you have a reasonable climate and give your house a lot of maintenance. London does not have a reasonable climate. And London in 1600 was third world poor, and nobody was giving anything much maintenance. So you will notice that these houses appear to be on the verge of falling down. In fact, I'd ask you to look up at the third floor level, look at the alley between the two houses in the center of the picture. At the third floor level, you'll see a sort of a horizontal thing running across the alley that looks rather like a log. Know what that is? It's a log. And if you ask yourself, gee, why would somebody go to all the trouble of hauling a log up to the third floor of their house and setting it across an alley? The answer is kind of like why firemen wear red suspenders. That log was hauled up there to keep the houses from falling down. The wooden wattle and daub, half-timbered houses of medieval Europe were shacks. The poor got little shacks, the rich got big shacks, but only noblemen in their town palaces got buildings that were built out of durable materials. I'd also ask you to consider these two houses as examples of architectural style, or rather as examples of something that is not architectural style, because when these houses were being built for middle-class people in London, here's what architectural style was like for the nobility and gentry of England. This is Blickling Hall in Norfolk, lovely place, first big English house I ever visited. And it really doesn't look the least bit like the houses we were just looking at in London. So one of the things that characterizes urban housing in 1600 is a huge class division where the nobility and gentry get to live in palaces and everybody else lives in shacks. And the shacks are poorly built and the shacks are ugly. They don't have any of the touches of high style architecture that's reserved entirely for noblemen, gentlemen, churches, kings, public buildings, courthouses, things like that. Middle class people in cities do not get durable materials, do not get architectural style, and every city in Northern Europe is like that as late as 1600. Well, somebody changes this. Somebody changes this. Somebody makes it possible for middle class people in cities to live in houses that are made of durable materials and have the high style of the architecture of their day. And who does this? Will the envelope please? This is done at the beginning of the 1600s by the Dutch. The Dutch invent the brick row house. Here are Amsterdam houses from the 1600s. You can tell that they're built of durable materials because they're still there. The Dutch were the first people since the ancient Romans who figured out how to mass produce bricks. And by the middle of the 1600s, the Dutch had kilns that could make 1 million bricks at a firing. And then look at the tops of these houses. This, my dear friends, is architectural style. This is not that different from Blickling Hall in Norfolk. And yet, this is not the house of a nobleman or a gentleman. Holland really didn't have noblemen and gentlemen. This house is only 15 feet wide. But Holland was the first major European country that was run by middle-class people in cities. The people who built this house were ordinary people, but they were no more ordinary than anybody else. And in fact, if you think about Holland in the 1600s, you will think about painting and about certain great Dutch painters who produced a revolution in the art of painting. Here's one, Johannes Vermeer. Another one is Rembrandt. They're the two biggest names. Frans Hals is a third name. If you think about what it is that the great Dutch painters of the period that the Dutch call their golden age, think about what they did. What they did was to look at ordinary people and find that ordinary people were fascinating. Vermeer painted at a time when the French and the Italians were just painting kings and popes and noblemen and mythological figures. Vermeer didn't do any of that. Here is his girl with a pearl earring. Who was she? Nobody knows. Somebody wrote a book about it, but it's fiction. Somebody made a movie about it, but it's fiction. Vermeer did not paint her because she was famous. Why did Vermeer paint her? I don't know. Nobody knows. But she's fascinating. She's a completely anonymous person. And for all I know, she may have been dull as dishwater and you wouldn't have wanted to have to talk to her at a cocktail party. But she was a human being, and Vermeer saw that she was fascinating because the great painters of that age saw that people as such, ordinary people, were fascinating. And that is what the architects of that generation did. They accomplished in the art of architecture what the great painters accomplished in the art of painting. Here is a canal street in Utrecht, or Utrecht as the Dutch say. No one of these houses is a remarkable work of architecture. Not a one of them looks anything like a cathedral in France or Italy. But put them together and they make one of the most beautiful environments I can think of. I have walked around lots of cities, and I think the first sentence in the first chapter of my book is Dutch cities are the pleasantest in the world. They're pleasant because the people who built these houses respected the people who were going to live in them. They saw the humanity, they saw the fascination of ordinary people living ordinary lives. And they were able to represent that in the art of architecture, just as the great painters were representing it in the art of painting. And it didn't just happen. It didn't happen organically. It took the influence of great architects. If any of you are great architects, and most of you probably are, you have a role to play in this too. Here is conceivably the greatest architect the Dutch have ever had. His name is Jacob van Campen. Jacob van Campen designed the first great work of classicism in the Netherlands, the Mauritshuis in The Hague, built in 1634. Absolutely perfect. You could write whole books about the Mauritshuis, or you could just shut up and look at it. They both work. It is just a perfect building, rising like Botticelli's Venus from a calm little canal in The Hague. This is one of the great architects in history, Jacob van Campen. The Dutch architects aren't as famous as they need to be. Jacob van Campen. And how does he enter in the story of the North Atlantic cities? Not just because he did a beautiful one-off building in The Hague, but because he designed the first brick row houses in the world. Here they are, two of them next to each other, fronting on a canal in Amsterdam, built for two brothers in 1622. This is the generation of Vermeer and Rembrandt. This is the birth of our building tradition here in the North Atlantic world that includes Philadelphia. Great architects helped the people to realize what it was that they wanted to accomplish. A wonderful, wonderful thing. And by 1672, when this picture was painted, the Dutch have built entire streets, entire canals, really entire cities in this new brick way of building. If I told you that Bruce Laverty had just discovered this picture and it was done even before William Birch and it showed Philadelphia with the dogleg of Dock Street in 1796, you might say, wow, okay. It was painted in Amsterdam in 1672, 10 years before Philadelphia was founded. The Dutch, in their golden age, invented our way of building. And it didn't take long for Londoners to figure out that the Dutch were onto something. London is the only city in the world that has more row houses than Philadelphia. Get to work, Philly, get to work. London's still ahead, but you can catch them. They're hearing footsteps. Build more row houses and you can catch them. London was the first place outside the Netherlands to pick up on the Dutch innovation. And again, it came because a great architect was able to help the people to figure out what they wanted to do and how to do it well. This is Inigo Jones. And like Inigo Jones, like Jacob van Campen, Inigo Jones designed the first great work of classicism in his country. Van Campen designed the Mauritshuis. Inigo Jones designed the banqueting house at Whitehall Palace. This was built in 1619 at a time when most even high-style buildings in Britain were made of red brick. High-style interiors in Britain in 1619 were dark with leaded glass, oak paneling, all these beautiful Elizabethan and Jacobean things. What's the interior of Inigo Jones's banqueting house like? It must have been like walking into a spaceship if you were a courtier of James I in 1619. This is revolutionary architecture. How does Inigo Jones enter into our story? Well, King Charles I made Inigo Jones essentially the building inspector for all of London development. He was surveyor of the king's works, but in 1630, he got an additional job. He became the Tsar of London expansion, and he wrote a building code that specified what you had to do if you were going to get permission to build in London after 1630. Well, what was it? Here's the first example of it. This is Covent Garden, which was built beginning in 1634. You also had to pay a permit fee. The permit fee for Covent Garden was about equal to the annual income of an English nobleman. Big permit fee. But here is Inigo Jones's revolutionary building code at work. If you go to Covent Garden in London now, it's a shopping mall. If you know My Fair Lady or Pygmalion, it was the Victorian vegetable market. But when Covent Garden was new, it was the very first residential square in London, and it was ultra fashionable. It's a very fashionable place. If you look at the houses that front it, there is Jones's building code at work. They are brick, they are flat fronted, the windows line up straight. It's almost like being in Holland. The church, that thing that looks like a Roman temple, we know was designed by Inigo Jones. We don't know whether he designed any of the houses that fronted on Covent Garden, but we know that they had to pass his inspection to get a building permit. And we know that the owner got a building permit because we know he paid £4,000 in the money of 1634, big permit fees. The revolution of row house architecture got a huge impulse when London burned down in 1666. Here's the Great Fire of London. Some baker got careless with banking his fire at night. And by the end of 3 days, 80,000 people were homeless. The Great Fire of London at the end of 1666 in September destroyed 14,000 houses, 101 churches, 42 guild halls, St. Paul's Cathedral, which you can see in the middle of the picture here. And all of London had to be rebuilt. And they wanted to rebuild it fast. And how on earth were they going to do that? Well, they already had Inigo Jones's building code. They put it into the form of a parliamentary ordinance, and a new London was built within 7 years. There were nowhere near enough carpenters, bricklayers, roofers, glaziers in London to build all of this. So King Charles said, come on, from any part of the kingdom, you can come and you can work in London, even if you're not a member of a London guild. You can work in London, and let's rebuild the city. And so people came to London from all over England and worked for 7 years to build what you're looking at now. And by the end of those 7 years, they knew how to do it. And then they had to leave. The job was done. There wasn't enough work. They all had to go somewhere else. Where did they go? Some went back to where they came from. Some went to other places. But wherever they went, they were able to say, I have the new London way of building. And the English are always wanting to do what London wants to do. And so the new London way of building spread even across the ocean. If you look at this picture of London and that picture of your own city of Philadelphia, not much difference between them, is there? I would bet that some of the ships that came over under William Penn's impetus contained people who had worked on the rebuilding of London. At any rate, Philadelphia became a city in the school of London as soon as Philadelphia was born. It's a really extraordinary thing. And if you walk the streets of Society Hill in Philadelphia, you are walking in the only place on earth that really looks and feels the way the city of London did after it was rebuilt in the 1660s and 1670s. An utterly remarkable survival. Most of the North Atlantic cities have great neighborhoods. What's great about Society Hill is just that. It is an amazing historical document. Even though much of it is a great deal newer than that. But boy, the tradition was durable. And it spread to the rest of America's old cities. Boston was not born in this tradition. And I do hope that you'll find my talk amusing, so you'll invite me back. And one of the things I can talk about is how it is that Boston decided to build row houses, which they didn't do for 150 years, and then decided to stop, which they did after 50 years. Why is that? Well, I'm not going to tell you. I want you to invite me back. I also want you to buy the book, but it's a heck of a story. But suffice it to say that Boston eventually got with the program and built some of the best row houses in the world. Here is houses in Pinckney Street on Beacon Hill overlooking Lewisburg Square. And if you have a better row house, please invite me over. These are awfully nice row houses. New York. If New York didn't have skyscrapers, we would think of New York as one of the great cities in the School of London and Amsterdam. In fact, it was New Amsterdam. Here we're overlooking Washington Square. If you can read the banner, it says NYU. This is New York as a row house city. And my beloved Baltimore. This is what I see when my dog and I walk out of the front door of our house, which we should do after this talk. He just came and lay down at my feet. We Baltimoreans are very definitely part of the North Atlantic world, and a jolly nice world it is too. Well, as soon as the North Atlantic cities figured out what their game was, they made a heck of a mess for themselves. They invented the Industrial Revolution. In the long run, of course, the Industrial Revolution was a good thing. It made us all rich, and we have modern medicine and atomic bombs, and well, maybe it wasn't such a good thing after all. At any rate, we're all living a lot longer until we're not living. So in the long run, the Industrial Revolution was a good thing, but in the short run, it was a mess. The Industrial Revolution was a real crisis for cities. It brought environmental degradation, a drastic shortening of lifespans, and at the same time, a colossal expansion of cities. The city of Manchester went from 700,000 people, 70,000 people to 2 million people in the course of the 19th century. And so did Philadelphia. And every city in the North Atlantic world grew that fast, and no cities anywhere else in the world were growing that fast. Our cities were the universities of rapid growth. And the generations that had to live through that rapid growth tended far too often to die young. People didn't understand basic principles of hygiene, and they all burned coal, and it was pretty grim. It was a huge challenge to our cities. They rose to the challenge, and they did it by inventing a lot of things that we take for granted. They invented public parks. Here is the first great public park in the world, in the city of Birkenhead, right outside Liverpool. And the 2 decades from 1840, when this park was built, until 1860, were the great age of the public park. Central Park in New York is 1857. This is when public parks come together. They don't come together in France until a little bit later, imitating England and us. And then the French do it better. Oh, well, they also cook better. We invented downtown. The North Atlantic trade was so big. There was so much stuff that had to be moved. There were so many people who had to sit there at desks or stand there at desks and keep account books, that we needed to colonize the sky to take care of all the stuff and all the people. We started with iron fronts. We went on to skyscrapers. I'd give you a talk about that. Invite me back and buy the book. It's a heck of a story. I didn't know it when I set out to write this. It's a heck of a story. We adapted the continental European apartment. And where we needed to, we built apartment buildings. New York certainly needed to, for reasons that have everything to do with its history and geography. Rittenhouse Square uses them very well. Apartments are an awfully nice addition to a city, and we figured out how to do that. And for better or worse, we invented year-round suburbia. The Italians didn't invent it. The French didn't invent it. The Germans didn't invent it. The English and the Americans invented year-round suburbia and did it in the 19th century. In the end, year-round suburbia would come back to haunt the North Atlantic cities and would almost kill them. But for several generations, year-round suburbia was something that was an addition to our urbanity and not a competitor to our urbanity, and was one of the great inventions that our ancestors came up with when they were trying to cope with rapid growth and environmental degradation during the Industrial Revolution. Here's Chestnut Hill. There are parts of Chestnut Hill that don't look like this, but if you can find me a part of Chestnut Hill that doesn't look good, let's not go look at it. Chestnut Hill looks pretty good. Well, the 20th century had more surprises, and they weren't good. By the end of the 19th century, people were happy, but at the beginning of the 20th century, whoops, you get World War I. That's a problem. And whoops, you get World War II. That's another problem. But the North Atlantic cities survived both of those problems. Europe got messed up horribly by both of the world wars, and England got bombed, and Holland got occupied. But by and large, the world wars treated the North Atlantic nations pretty lightly. And the wars did not cause trouble for the North Atlantic cities. But cars did, particularly in America. Here is a fine example of what a car looked like when I was a kid. And when Americans bought cars, which they began to do in large numbers in the 19 teens, and when cars became ubiquitous in some year like 1957, you got automotive suburbia. Here is Levittown outside New York. There's a Levittown outside Philadelphia. It's called Willingboro now. They all looked the same. And whether your automotive suburbia was in fact built by William Levitt didn't matter very much. Post-war automotive suburbia tended to look like this. It has about the same density as Houston Heights. You will see a bunch of cars parked on these streets. And I don't know how you can live in a neighborhood like this without owning a car. This is automotive suburbia, and it became the standard way for Americans to build and live in the decades after World War II. Not just in the Midwest, not just in California, but even in the old civilized North Atlantic parts of America, like New York and Philadelphia. And these new automotive neighborhoods drained the middle classes out of our cities, and jobs followed their best workers. So by the time I got out of college in the mid 1970s, every one of the North Atlantic cities on both sides of the ocean was in what people at the time called the urban crisis. And large parts of every one of these cities were vacant. Each of these cities had lost some substantial part of its population. Here are vacant houses in Baltimore. Here are vacant houses in Philadelphia. Amsterdam didn't have any vacant houses by the time I got there in the late 1980s. But in the 30 years after World War II, Amsterdam lost 75% of its people. Baltimore and Philadelphia have lost 30% of their people, and we're worried about that. Amsterdam lost 75% of its people, worse than Detroit. Amsterdam has since bounced back, but this hit every city on both sides of the ocean. And worst hit was New York. Here is the epicenter of the urban crisis. This is the South Bronx of New York in 1975. Vacant apartment buildings, rubble-strewn vacant lots. This is what happens when a city loses 1 million people. There weren't enough people to occupy the houses. And it doesn't go gracefully. For those of you who missed the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, there's always the South Bronx in the 1970s. And it was easy to see because Route 95 runs right through it. And if you were driving through the South Bronx in the 1970s, as I often did, get to college and back, it took a long time to get through it because Route 95 was still under construction and it took forever. So millions of people saw this. And by 1975, New York was done. It had given away too many of its middle class people. It didn't have enough jobs. It didn't have enough tax base. New York City was the center of the world financial system. But in the spring of 1975, New York City ran out of money. In New York City, the mayor of New York asked President Gerald Ford, who was a nice guy, for help. He said, Mr. President, we're New York City. We're the nation's greatest city. You need us. The answer that Gerald Ford, who was a nice guy, gave to the mayor of New York sums up what Americans thought about cities in 1975. Here is the New York Daily News headline the next day. Ford to city, drop dead. The federal government refused to help New York avert municipal bankruptcy. And most serious urban thinkers, as late as 1975, thought that our cities were incurable, but they thought that was okay because they thought we didn't need cities anymore. We could live suburban lives. We could live in Levittown. We could drive everywhere. We could do business by phone. We could have offices in suburban office parks. They thought that was great. They thought that we didn't need to have cities anymore. Well, New York didn't drop dead. New York has regained its million people and then some. And New York is now suffering troubles of overgrowth rather than undergrowth. Even the South Bronx is now full again. Amsterdam is now one of the more expensive places in Europe. And Philadelphia, which many people were writing off when Frank Rizzo was mayor, seems to have a very healthy real estate market in large parts of its land area. So the reports of the death of the North Atlantic city were somewhat exaggerated. Our cities have survived, and that gets to what I think is the greatest contribution that you Philadelphians have made to the art of city building in modern times. Here is William Penn's original map of Philadelphia in 1682. No, you didn't do that in modern times. William Penn is the only American colonist who actually hired a surveyor. And he gave you the best city plan in the 17th century world. But I'd ask you just to think about which land does Penn's original plan cover? Well, you've got the Delaware River on this side and the Schuylkill River on that side, which is about 2.5 miles. And from north to south, it's about 1.5 miles. This is the original Philadelphia. And it is also a district that Philadelphians reconceived in the middle of the 1940s and began to build in the 1950s. And your ancestors in Philadelphia in the 1940s and 50s gave a new name to the center of your city and to this kind of a center. They called it Center City. No one had ever used the phrase Center City before. That's a Philadelphia invention. And most cities don't use it now. I wish every city used it. And if you read my book, and I certainly hope you will, you'll find that I say all kinds of nice things about Center City, Philadelphia. And I speak of other cities as having center cities that are either as good as yours or almost as good as yours or nowhere near as good as yours. And there's a full range of them. So here you're looking at Center City, Philadelphia, which is also William Penn's Philadelphia. And you'll notice that sort of more than halfway back is the skyscraper district. So Center City includes downtown with the office skyscrapers, but it also includes a lot else. Center City is not just downtown, and your Philadelphia ancestors were the first people who ever thought of that, who ever thought of the center of your city as including downtown, but being more than downtown, as something that could form up around downtown, support downtown, be supported by downtown, a large area with a coherent development plan, including downtown, but not limited to downtown. That's a Philadelphia invention. Of course, Edmund Bacon and the Pennsylvania Railroad spent a lot of time trying to stimulate the office market in downtown Philadelphia, and they obviously did a fine job. Here's where they started with Penn Center, which I don't think is brilliant architecture, but it kept downtown Philadelphia in the game, and downtown Philadelphia is certainly in the game now, and it took down the Chinese Wall, which was a fine idea. So they certainly paid attention to the downtown office market. They certainly paid attention to the traditional, the conventional American downtown. But they also paid attention to all the areas on this map that are not downtown. They thought that there should be museums. And now there are more great museums than they ever dreamt of. They thought that there should be public life and street life. And now there's much more of it than they ever dreamt of in Old City or along South Street. Ed Bacon wanted to tear South Street down for an expressway. Thank God it didn't happen. And now Center City, Philadelphia includes office buildings, yes, but a lot more. And it is a place where an awful lot of people live, and they don't necessarily live the way Manhattanites live in tall apartment buildings that look like office buildings. You certainly have them, but Center City includes real neighborhoods. Center City is about 4 square miles. It's huge and it's coherent, and it includes lots of Philadelphia's great standard North Atlantic neighborhoods. Yes, and great parks, beautifully managed, beautifully maintained. You have the best business improvement district in the country. So says my friend Alex Garvin, who's written a book about business improvement districts. He thinks you have the best, and he's a New Yorker. And they do wonderful work. And you can walk for miles in Center City, Philadelphia, and forget that the skyscrapers are there. There are lots of different environments, all within easy walking distance of each other. You can live at high density, you can work at high density, you can live at low density, you can live at high density, you can do all of this stuff. You can play grubby, you can play high, you can go to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia in Washington Square. And you can have views like this that sum up the diversity of the center of your city, of Center City. No other city in the world has views like this. Every city in the North Atlantic has skyscrapers somewhere, and every city in the North Atlantic has row houses somewhere. Nothing, no place that I know has the marvelous interpenetration of one with the other that you have in what you call, and you invented the phrase, Center City. A marvelous, marvelous thing. Now, you're going to have to defend it because people are now beginning to attack the diversity of neighborhoods in Center City. People are now beginning to say that Center City isn't dense enough, that Center City, that Philadelphia as a whole isn't dense enough. And they're saying this for environmental reasons. They're saying that you need New York density or Parisian density to get people out of cars. They're going to tell you that Philadelphia's subway system is not good enough. And I'll tell you the same thing. I've ridden on the subway systems of every North Atlantic city that has them. Your city is as big as Paris, and your underground rail system is not good enough. You need to do better than that. So do we in Baltimore. I'm not casting stones, but you need to do more than that. But do you need to tear down all your row houses and build New York style apartment buildings in order to have a good subway system? Do you need to tear it all down and do that? You're going to find people in Philadelphia who tell you that you need to tear down as much of your city as possible and make as much of it as possible look like this, or at least be this dense. I can pretty well guarantee it won't look this good. Do you need to do that? Well, for my money, the best transportation system in the world is in London. The London Underground and the rest of Transport for London. London is even bigger than Philadelphia, but not a lot bigger. You have about 7 million people in your metropolitan area. London has about 8. And London has the best transportation system that I regularly use. And London doesn't look like New York. In fact, London looks like Philadelphia. And if you average population density, London and Philadelphia are almost exactly the same. So if people tell you we need a better mass transit system, And to do that, we need to become much denser. You just say, I'll grant you we need a better transportation system, but we don't need to ruin our lives to get one. We are Philadelphia, and we can do this as Philadelphians. So here's an introduction to a book called The North Atlantic Cities. I hope you'll have questions. I hope you'll invite me back to tell you some of the stories that are in the book. And I hope that you will imagine that I'm now going to go to the back of the room and sit at a table and sign books and say for Aunt Marge, thanks so much, Charlie Duff. Since I won't, you can buy the book from a website, www.northatlanticcities.com. And Beth, Tess, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate this. Has been fascinating, and we're getting questions coming in. We have a little bit of time here to ask and answer a few questions.
Went a little long, sorry.
Few folk have noted that there is actually a Levittown in Bucks County. So I think you addressed Paula's question about the pressure to build multifamily housing and tear down single family homes. Dennis says he went to Maryland Law School and lived in Baltimore and worked with Bob Embry.
Good.
He said he believes that Bob saved many row houses in Baltimore and that his ideas were innovative. And he's wondering if you have any thoughts on why those policies did not expand to other cities.
Well, to some extent they did. But the biggest reason is that we had Bob Embry and those poor slobs didn't. Bob Embry is a genius and is one of my favorite people. I'd love to come and give you a talk about the things that Bob Embry did to rebuild Baltimore. I showed you a picture of some vacant buildings in Baltimore in the mid-1970s, cute little row houses. Bob Embry invented the idea of selling them for $1 and helping people to fix them up. You could buy one for $1, but you had to agree to fix it up within 18 months, and then you had to agree to live in it for 18 months. And it worked. Nobody imagined that anybody would ever want to do that, but they did want to do that, and it worked. And let's maybe we need an Athenaeum of Philadelphia tour of Baltimore, which maybe whoever asked the question, forgive me, I don't remember his name. Maybe we can convince Bob Embry to lead it.
That's a good idea. So one of our audience members notes that they experience Society Hill as an expensive vertical suburb without much street life within Society Hill. That many of the residents escape to country houses. So you sort of have folks who have two homes. How do you address something like that, or is that just sort of endemic to some of our neighborhoods that people choose to use this as their city pied a terre and also spend time at the country or the beach?
I'm married to a New Yorker, and I know a lot of New Yorkers, and I'm related to a certain number of them. And I don't know 6 of them who were on Manhattan Island for most of the pandemic. As far as I can tell, New Yorkers who live in high-rise apartment buildings all have country houses if they can afford to. My cousins can't, but everybody they know can. And so I don't think it's in any way peculiar to Society Hill. I've often seen and heard people criticizing Society Hill because it doesn't have street life. And I've often heard people criticizing Society Hill because it's expensive. What that suggests is that there are people who are willing to pay a lot of money to live in a city neighborhood that doesn't have any street life, and that's important. I think that a city needs to have a long menu of neighborhoods. It needs to have neighborhoods that are noisy and neighborhoods that are quiet, neighborhoods that are dense, neighborhoods that are relatively less dense. If the whole city of Philadelphia were Society Hill, that might be a little bit dull. But Philadelphia is a big place. Society Hill is a small place. If you want some place that is denser, go make one. So Philadelphia has lots of vacant houses, lots of vacant lots. Go make one and let Society Hill be itself. Philadelphia still has the problem that it has far too little taxable income and wealth to sustain itself. Philadelphia, if you stay in Center City, you could think that Philadelphia is out of the urban crisis. You can think that Philadelphia is now one with London and Paris and everything is just hunky-dory. If you look at any statistics about Philadelphia, they are very sobering. And the Inquirer frequently refers to Philadelphia as the poorest of America's large cities. It is. If you've got rich tax-paying people who want to live in Society Hill, kiss them for me. You need more. There are far too many prosperous people, interesting people, who are living in your suburbs and driving too much and killing polar bears. And the world would be a better place if they lived at higher density than they're living. They don't have to live as densely as New York and Paris. They can live as densely as Society Hill. A city needs a long menu of neighborhoods that are dense enough. And Society Hill is dense enough. I live in a neighborhood that's pretty quiet. I've lived in neighborhoods that are noisier than this, but I don't want to do that now. Cities need long menus.
Deirdre gives a shout out for South Philadelphia, where there are many fabulous row houses and,
Yep.
and thinks the energy is there these days. And Tess notes, of course, the outdoor dining brought more life to our city streets.
Yep.
So we are seeing that as one of the benefits. Penny's wondering, do you include Venice in these northern Atlantic cities that have row houses, or does it fit into the equation?
No, because it's the building types of Venice are really quite different. The thing, Venice is still it's sort of the world's best example of a pre-modern city, but it's still a pre-modern city. If you think of the great family palaces on the Canal Grande, they are family palaces, most divided into apartments or hotels now, but the rich lived in palaces. And everybody else lived in multifamily dwellings. Some of them were wider, some of them were narrower, but they were not by and large row houses in our sense. They were not single family houses. They were more like the multifamily houses of old Paris. The single family row house really is a Dutch and English kind of thing. And nothing against Venice. I like Venice. Maybe we need an Athenaeum tour of Venice.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's go, but it's different.
Well, Eileen, it's interesting. Eileen notes that the first house that you showed in your from Philadelphia is actually her daughter's house at
Really?
24th and Spruce. She said it's looking much better since that photo. So maybe Eileen, you can send Charlie an updated photo.
Send it to Mr. Google. Get Mr. Google to put the updated photo up front.
So Jean has an interesting question here too, as we look at different cities and the differences. She says, as a New Yorker who grew up in a 19th century row house, I now love Philadelphia for its 18th century character and appreciate your analysis. Mm-hmm. She's having traveled through small German and French towns built on the backs of round walls. Can you comment on how these row homes in circles are different than those of the Netherlands, other than their wattle and daub that has survived?
No, I can't. I don't know.
Okay. That would be
great idea.
Yeah, that's a great something to sort of research, right? What is it? Mm-hmm. They're all little kind of fortress towns in that way.
One of the interesting things about the Dutch towns, people have often told me, well, Dutch towns are not as dense as French towns and German towns because they weren't always being attacked by armies. They didn't need to have all those walls. The Dutch built their golden age cities while they were involved in a war with Spain that lasted for 80 years. And every one of those Dutch row house cities was surrounded by big walls with cannons on the top. So the Dutch could have crowded themselves in the way the Germans and the French did, but they didn't.
So I think one last question, perhaps we could relate this one to your work with Jubilee Baltimore and sort of in rebuilding Baltimore, how to maintain this culture of row houses and foster a culture of row houses and community and street life that also encourages diversity, socioeconomic, racial, diversity in the city. Not like, as you say, Society Hill is fairly monoculture, socioeconomically, racially, prices a lot of people out.
Yeah, I mean, mixed income neighborhoods is basically what I do. We have built about 400 houses and apartments that are pretty expensive, and 400 houses and apartments that use the low income housing tax credit. And I'm thinking now of one neighborhood where we began to work 15 years ago. And at that time, the neighborhood was 60% vacant, 60% vacant buildings or vacant lots. There's no vacancy there now, or very little. And now what we're doing is helping long-term residents with home repairs that they can't afford. We're raising money and running jobs and trying to make it possible. Also, I don't know if Philadelphia has something like this, but I think it does. All the Maryland counties have a provision whereby for long-term homeowners of low income, the state gives you a tax credit rebate. So even if your neighborhood values go through the roof, your property taxes never get high enough to price you out. And so what that means is that neighborhood change in Baltimore happens very slowly. And that's good and bad, depending on who you talk to, but it's universal. It happens very slowly. And so every neighborhood in Baltimore that has prosperous people is in fact a mixed income neighborhood, and neighborhoods that want to remain that way tend to call us at Jubilee and say, how do we keep this going? Right? It's not easy. It takes money. It takes money. It takes money to get people to move into neighborhoods that are half abandoned. And it takes money to keep poor people in neighborhoods that are expensive. It takes money.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm noticing the comments, lots of wonderful thank you for, a fantastic talk. It's been wonderful. Everybody, please join me with a virtual thank you.
Well,
Charles Duff for a wonderful talk. Again, you can find his book, northatlanticcities.com, and he showed you where to buy. And if you want to come back on Thursday evening, we have Patricia Sullivan with her brand new book. I think it hasn't even quite been released yet. Justice Rising, Robert Kennedy's America in Black and White. Jason Karlowish will be at noon next Tuesday, talking about the problem with Alzheimer's. If you're paying any attention, he's showing up everywhere in conversations, and he's here at UPenn. Looking forward to hearing his talk. Thanks to Richard Bartholomew, who's here tonight, for connecting us with him. Elena Roberts, Black Freedom on Native Lands. I've been here all the while to look at the relationships of African Americans and Native Americans during Reconstruction, is coming up next Tuesday evening. We're kind of got the crush here at the end of the season. We have a number of other we're going in the following week, starting on the 27th to European, looking at French women in the Enlightenment on the 27th. Women keeping house in 17th century England on the June 1st, and on June 8th, Venetians invented everything. So we're going to get a little flavor of our Atlantic world coming up. Invite you to show up for more programs. Sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. Become a member, and we look forward to seeing more of everybody in person and virtually. And Charlie, thank you so much. We look forward to having you live at the Athenaeum sometime. And I love your idea about going and doing a tour of Baltimore.